The Yugioh trading card game has been out now for over 20 years in the US, and in that time, the game has changed substantially. One of the clearest areas it has changed is in its summoning mechanics, as new and innovative ways to play are one of the cornerstones of evolving the game over time. With this in mind, we're going to take a look back over the history of different summoning mechanics in Yu-Gi-Oh!, how they've changed as the game has evolved, and how we've reached where we are today. With the advent of the TCG and The Legend of Blue Eyes White Dragon in March 2002, there were a total of 5 card types in the game, being normal monsters, effect monsters, magic cards, which were later changed to spell cards, trap cards, and fusion monsters. Being the outlier of the original card types, fusion monsters were not played in the standard main deck like the other 4 types. Rather, they were kept separate in what was referred to at the time as the fusion deck. These monsters were all very similar, being larger bodies with no effects that required 2 specific monsters to be combined together with the card polymerization, which allowed a player to fusion summon by sending the listed materials from hand or field to grave. While you could get out powerhouse threats like Metal Dragon and Gaia the Dragon Champion, the mechanic was initially far too clunky to ever be considered in those early days, seeing far more emphasis placed on large bodies that could be summoned easier, like Lejeune and Summon Skull. As packs started to come down the pipeline, nothing really changed this fact. Even with the first fusion substitution monsters printed in the first tournament pack, designed to make fusion summons less clunky by replacing any one named material in a fusion summon, no one really played fusions in a competitive sense. The first playable fusion wouldn't be seen until late 2002 in Pharaoh's Servant, being Thousand Eyes Restrict, a fusion of the previously released Relinquished that had the same effect and locked attacking and battle position swapping. While by no means usable in a competitive sense, Restrict was extremely commendable at the time for being the first ever effect fusion monster. And on top of that, its effect was actually really good, just not practical to summon out consistently. Restrict's release would be the beginning of a shift in focus on fusion designs, giving more fusion monsters powerful effects to help offset the cost of summoning them consistently. This would be clearly seen in Labyrinth of Nightmare in March 2003 with the release of Last Warrior from Another Planet, a fusion who locked all summons while on the field. Again though, Last Warrior wouldn't see competitive success due to the clunky nature of fusion summons. However, released alongside him was a new innovation in fusion summons in Summoner of Illusions, a flip effect monster that summoned any fusion from the fusion deck but destroyed it during the end phase. This was the first step forward in a concept that would clearly stick for the remainder of the DM era, being ways to cheat out fusion monsters without actually fusion summoning them. Summoner was far too slow to be used, being a flip effect monster with no real way to enable flipping himself in a fast manner, but he would lay the groundwork for similar effects in upcoming sets. In a similar vein to Last Warrior, Legacy of Darkness in June 2003 would bring Dark Balter the Terrible and Ryu Senshi, who can negate normal spells and normal traps respectively. These two were once again steps forward for powerful fusions, but remain niche for the same reasons as before. In order to enable any of these powerful fusions, there needed to be a better way to cheat them out than Summoner. Pharaonic Guardian, released in September 2003, came with an extremely powerful new spell in Metamorphosis, which had the ability to tribute any monster to special summon a fusion monster of the same level from the fusion deck. While not popular out the gate due to still needing to invest in a specifically leveled monster to use, Metamorphosis would slowly pick up usage in the late stages of the DM era and early GX era. The reason for this was not the expected usage of tributing a level 5 to 7 to summon Last Warrior, Dark Balter, or Ryu Senshi, but instead to tribute sheep tokens summoned off the previously released Scapegoat in order to summon Thousand Eyes Restrict, which would proceed to halt all battle-related moves from either player. The next major steps of fusion summoning wouldn't be too far off, as with the release of Magician's Force in October 2003, 2 major releases would change fusions as a whole. The first of these, which had far less impact in the short term, but would hold long-term relevance, was XYZ Dragon Cannon, the first ever instance of contact fusion, a term referring to the fusion summon of a monster by moving the materials on field to another location without polymerization. XYZ Dragon Cannon was the first card to do this, banishing its 3 materials from the field to summon itself, which was a monumental task to perform as each of the materials needed to be summoned individually before they could be fused. While there were ways to cheat them out thanks to their classification as union monsters, the mechanic was far too slow at the time to be taken seriously, but would be iterated on in later formats to varying levels of success. The far more explosive short-term impact would come from Magical Scientist, who, for the cost of 1,000 life points, could summon any level 6 or lower fusion monster from the fusion deck, returning it to the fusion deck at the end of the turn. This effect was not once per turn, meaning it could be used as many times as you had life points for. Because of this, Magical Scientist would be almost immediately discovered as an FTK enabler, or first turn kill enabler, being paired with Catapult Turtle to rapidly fire level 6 fusions into the opponent's life points for lethal damage. In addition to this, cards like Last Will made it extremely simple to put both Scientist and Turtle on the board together, so the FTK was fairly consistent for this early era. Eventually, Magical Scientist was limited for this reason, and eventually banned, but the FTK became so synonymous with the card that it was very rare for someone to play it and not be on the FTK. The idea of cheating out fusion monsters became the go-to way to summon a majority of the fusions in the game because of how clunky the mechanic was, as previously stated. Even with cards like King of the Swamp and Ancient Sanctuary in June 2004, who was both a fusion substitute and a searcher for polymerization, no one was properly fusing for a monster at this point, especially with the rise of chaos in this time period. This would be even further emphasized by Cyberstein, the Shonen Jump Championship prize card for 2004, who could pay 5,000 life points to special summon any fusion monster from the fusion deck with no strings attached. Stein was by far and away the best monster for cheating out a fusion, but two factors held it back on initial release. 1. 5,000 life points is a lot of life points to summon out one of the usual big fusion targets, none of which really win you the game on their own at this stage. 2. It was an SJC prize card, meaning very few people had access to it. He would eventually be reprinted in Dark Beginning 2 for a more publicly accessible version, but even then he wouldn't see much play. It would take a few formats to be discovered for how powerful he really was, which we'll discuss soon. The last major shift in fusion summons for the DM era came right at the end of the era in the form of the Hex-Sealed Fusion series, being Light, Dark, and Earth. All three of these were fusion substitutes that could special summon a fusion monster of their attribute by tributing materials from the field, including themselves, without using polymerization. This was notably not considered a fusion summon, though by all metrics should have been, but either way saw no meta impact for its time period, as you had to have the remaining materials on the board to perform the summon this way, reducing the necessary materials of fusion summoning down to 2. Even still, having both this and the remaining material on board was too slow, and thus, fusion summons entered the GX era, where new directions in card design would directly impact how the fusion mechanic would develop. With the dawn of a new era in the game, massive changes to the structure of the game would slowly become apparent over the course of the next few years, the most prominent change of which would be the beginning of proper archetypes in the game. While archetypes had been around in the previous era, such as with Gravekeepers, more archetypes would begin to surface here with a clear focus on specific naming conventions, locking support to those archetypes. The first, and easily most recognizable of these, were Elemental Heroes, released in the Lost Millennium in June 2005. A series of monsters that could be fused together with polymerization to form a litany of different fusion monsters, all of which required specific heroes to make. This was not only a major step in archetype design, but also a major step in fusion as a mechanic, being the first truly dedicated fusion strategy. The only issue was it was just absolutely awful in terms of playability, as each of these elemental hero fusions were not only extremely specific in their materials, but also extremely underwhelming in their individual impact. Though the archetype was not great out the gate, elemental heroes, and more specifically heroes in general, would become known over the future eras as one of the cornerstones of fusion's development as a concept, as a majority of changes that would come to the mechanic over the years would be tested within hero archetypes before being brought out to other strategy. With experimentation with fusion clearly on the table, the next set, Cybernetic Revolution in August 2005, would make further advancements to the mechanic as a whole. The first of these was Cyber Dragon, a series of monsters focused around Cyber Dragon, a 2100 attack main deck monster that could be fused with multiple copies of itself to make powerful fusions, with 2 making Cyber Twin Dragon, who could attack twice every turn, and 3 making Cyber End Dragon, a 4000 attack monster with piercing. Cyber Dragon itself would become meta without the fusions, as the ability to drop a 2100 attack body for free was incredible for every deck at the time. But eventually, both of the fusions would see play for very different reasons. The first, and probably most well-known reason, was Cyberstein, as the card finally had a massive game-ending target to summon, able to either get a dual attacker or a massive piercer for the cost of 5,000 life points, which could then be made even larger with limiter removal and megamorph, which would almost always be online thanks to the 5,000 life point cost. Upon this powerful combo being discovered, it would become played in almost every deck that could run it, leading to the emergency banning of Cyberstein in late 2006. The second would be in Demise OTK decks, which could already clear the board without issue thanks to Demise, then could use Metamorphosis to turn their Demise into Cyber Twin Dragon for extra damage, once again seeing play with Megamorph to push those damage numbers up, getting Metamorphosis banned similar to Cyberstein. The deck also received its own version of Polymerization in Power Bond, which did the same thing as Polymerization for machine monsters, but added the effect to double the summoned monster's attack, dealing damage equal to the original attack to the user at the end of the turn. This wouldn't be nearly as used as the other 3 cards, but would be one of the first major instances of new versions of Polymerization that could be used in more niche circumstances. Lastly, the first ever Grave Fusion spells, which could fusion summon using materials in the grave instead of the hand by banishing them, were released here, being Dragon's Mirror, being locked to summoning only dragon monsters, and Miracle Fusion, which was locked to the Elemental Hero archetype, another instance of Hero being an innovator of fusion mechanics. The next major wave of fusion-based support would come in Power of the Duelist in August of 2006, once again being seemingly focused around Cyber Dragon and its various support pieces. A new fusion, Chimera Tech Overdragon, would be released here, the first ever fusion released in the TCG to have generic materials, requiring 1+ machine monsters in addition to a copy of Cyber Dragon, who nuked the user's board on summon, had attack equal to the number of monsters used to summon it times 800, and could attack that many times. Notably, this was not the first use of generic materials overall, as Five-Headed Dragon had already been released in the OCG back in 2002, but this was the first instance of it in the TCG. In addition, a new fusion spell was created to help enable this massive monster, being Overload Fusion, which was a fuse from grave spell for dark machine monsters. Lastly, one other fusion spell was printed here, being the first ever fusion spell to fuse using monsters in the deck, Future Fusion. Future Fusion revealed a monster in the fusion deck, dumped the materials from the deck to the grave, then 2 turns later would summon the monster revealed, linking the 2 together so if one died, they both died. On release, Future Fusion's summon effect was always considered too slow to be relevant, but the ability to dump materials from the deck was instantly intriguing, seeing experimentation as an enabler for Chimera Tech Overdragon alongside Overload Fusion, as an Overdragon summoned by Future Fusion would do nothing since it would nuke the Future Fusion on summon. Future Fusion would later be used alongside the previously mentioned Five-Headed Dragon when it was released in the TCG to serve as a dump of 5 dragons from the deck to the grave, which in later formats would be considered unbelievably powerful, getting the card eventually banned, errata to dump the monster 1 turn after the activation, then released from the ban list again. Contact Fusion would once again be experimented with in the same set, with the release of Elemental Hero Neos and his fusion monsters, all requiring Neos and a Neospatian to be returned from the field to the deck rather than using Polymerization. While this was a novel concept, contact fusing by returning to the deck rather than banishing the materials, Neos and his fusions would be absolutely awful on release, as Neos was a 7-star normal monster, meaning he was not easy to get onto the board himself, and his fusions were all crippled with the condition of returning to the fusion deck at the end of the turn, meaning that all of the effort put into summoning them would be lost at the end of the turn anyways. This, however, would lay the foundation for a new strategy to come about soon after that would take far better advantage of the contact fusion mechanic than Neos ever did. Soon after, in Cyberdark Impact in November of 2006, another powerful fusion spell would be released, though it seemed extremely unassuming at the time. Instant Fusion, for the cost of 1,000 life points, could summon any level 5 or lower fusion monster from your fusion deck, but destroyed it during the end phase. This would see absolutely no play on release, as no fusion under level 5 was worth summoning in this way, as the only remotely viable fusion for this at the time was Thousand Eyes Restrict, who had been banned a couple of months prior. However, this would be one of the biggest fusion spells in later formats in conjunction with other summoning mechanics and different fusions from the later formats. With the stage set from Neos a year prior, Gladiator Beast would be released in Gladiator's Assault in November 2007, being an archetype focused around battling, then returning themselves to the deck to summon out different Gladiator Beasts, triggering their effects on summon. This would be capped off with their fusion boss monsters Diaz and Heraklinos, able to be summoned via contact fusion of a specific Gladiator Beast and others, Gladiator Beast's tag-out mechanic would become meta-relevant almost immediately, proving the concept as viable, and would push Contact Fusion even further with the eventual release of Gyzaris almost a year later, which would further bolster the deck's power level in the oppressive Return Dad format. As for the remainder of the GX era, Dark Calling would be a fusion from Grave spell for evil heroes that mostly only saw play in cheese decks using Dark Gaia. Super Polymerization was a quick play spell that could not be responded to by the opponent and could fuse using materials on both players' fields. While not immediately popular due to the mostly rigid requirements of fusion monsters at the time, Super Polymerization would eventually become exceptionally powerful as fusion materials continued to get more and more generic. Lastly, Elemental Hero Prisma could reveal a fusion monster in the fusion deck, send a monster listed on it from your deck to the grave, and make its name that monster's name until the end of the turn, which was intended to help alleviate the strict nature of Elemental Hero fusions, but instead would be quickly slotted into Gladiator Beasts, as you could send a Gladiator Beast from deck to grave to copy its name, then contact fuse using Prisma as that monster, most commonly being used to send Bestiari for Gyzaris. With these releases, the GX era came to an end and the game was refocused on a new summoning mechanic, which would not only overshadow fusions with its rapid success, but also push almost all development of the mechanic to the back for the next few years. With the beginning of the 5Ds era and the introduction of Synchro Monsters, the Fusion deck was changed to the Extra deck to help reduce confusion, and fusions were relegated to support almost exclusively from non-main set sources, with the exception of the occasional OCG import. This would mainly be seen in manga promotions, as at the time, the Yugioh GX manga, which was vastly different from the anime, was still going, which had already given the game a couple of powerful threats like Light and Darkness Dragon at the end of the GX era. The first manga promo to help shake things up would be the Shonen Jump promo from March of 2009, being Chimera Tech Fortress Dragon, a contact fusion of Cyber Dragon and any number of machines from either player's field, turning Cyber Dragon into an extremely popular side deck option for many formats after, as the free special summon of Cyber Dragon could easily turn into a board wipe against any machine deck. The next few, being released in Ancient Prophecy as an OCG import, and the GX manga Volume 4 in September of 2009 and January 2010 respectively, would be Elemental Hero Gaia and Absolute Zero, two of the fusions used by Jaden in the manga version of GX. These two were vastly different from every elemental hero that came before them, as they didn't require specific monsters to make them. Rather, they required an elemental hero and any monster of their attribute, with Earth for Gaia and Water for Absolute Zero. This was the next step in the generalization of fusion materials, with Absolute Zero in particular seeing experimentation alongside Miracle Fusion for some decks of the era, although would not break into meta success until further support for heroes was released later. One of only two non-import main set contributions to the mechanic would be seen in Duelist Revolution in August 2010, with Miracle Synchro Fusion, a fuse from Grave spell that could be used if the fusion monster being summoned listed a Synchro as material. This was printed to help support the newly released Dragon Knight Draco Equesti and Ultimate Axon Kicker, neither of which would see any relevant meta play, as they were not worth the investment required in addition to the meta shifting rapidly from other releases in the same set, such as Effect Veiler, Pot of Duality, and Solemn Warning. Another addition to the Fusion cheat-out theme would be seen in Temple of the Kings, released in Structure Deck Merrick in October 2010. This card, when paired with Mystical Beast of Serket, could summon any fusion monster from your extra deck by sending both from field to grave, which was an insane effect to give alongside the ability to activate trap cards the turn they were set. Of course, this would never make an impact on the TCG, as both cards were banned the day they were released, primarily due to the trap effect, meaning we never got to see it played until it was eventually errated and released from the ban list years later, at which point it was already so far past the point of relevance that it saw no play. Although it was probably a good thing it was banned, as easily the strongest monster to be cheated out for a control strategy was released soon after, being Naturia Exterio in Hidden Arsenal 4 in April of 2011, being a fusion of Naturia Beast and Barkion, the archetype's key synchro monsters, able to negate any spell or trap that activates. This was easily the best monster to cheat out with any fusion cheat effects. However, at the time of release, almost every single relevant one had been banned, such as Cyberstein and Metamorphosis, meaning the only way to summon an Exterio that would stay on board was the correct way, by fusing Beast and Barkion with either Polymerization or the newly released Miracle Synchro Fusion. As the GX manga began to wind up, more and more of the fusions used in it would be brought over to the TCG, such as Elemental Hero The Shining as a promo card in GX Volume 6 in March 2011, which was the light fusion target and would be played in hero decks almost instantly, as it provided a way to recur your banished resources with its floating effect. Lastly, released at the end of the 5Ds era in Extreme Victory in May 2011, Gladiator Beast Esadari was a contact fusion of any two Gladiator Beasts, removing the necessity of having a specifically named Gladiator Beast to summon. While Gladiator Beasts were a good bit out of the meta at this point, Esadari would allow the deck to see some solid uptick in play rate, although not too substantial as the format was dominated by decks like Tengu Plants. With this, the 5Ds era came to an end, and with almost no relevant releases to push the mechanic forward in any substantial ways outside of materials becoming more generic. This, unfortunately, would hold true as the game moved into the Zexal era too, although a couple of standout releases would break the convention of what exactly was necessary to fuse your deck's boss monster. Similarly to the 5Ds era before it, the Zexal era would be focused more on its new summoning mechanic, being Exceeds this time, rather than forwarding the mechanic of fusion summons in any substantially meaningful way, leaving all changes to side sets, promotional releases, and OCG imports, just like the 5Ds era. The first of these would be the archetype of Gem Knights, released in Hidden Arsenal 5 in December 2011, a fusion archetype not unlike Elemental Heroes, but whose primary gimmick was that of its fusion spell Gem Knight Fusion, which could recur itself to hand by banishing a monster of the archetype from the grave. Similarly to early heroes, the fusion summonables from this archetype were widely unremarkable outside of a janky FTK deck made from Gem Knight Lady Lapis Lazuli, leading to the archetype being mostly forgotten until later support in the Arc 5 era. Similarly to the 5Ds era, the only archetype of note pushing the mechanic of fusion summoning forward was once again Hero, but in a turn of events, it was not exclusively Elemental Hero this time. Once again, thanks to the GX manga, new hero archetypes were being printed into existence through side sets and OCG imports. For Elemental Heroes, we received Nova Master, Great Tornado, and Escuriado to round out the Elemental fusions, in addition to Parallel World Fusion, which could fusion summon any Elemental Hero by returning banished materials to the deck, but had to be the only special summon you performed that turn. Vision Heroes were a new subtype of heroes, being used by Aster Phoenix in the GX manga, which were fusion monsters requiring any hero monster as material, with 2 summoning Adoration and 3 summoning Trinity, giving generic fusion targets for any hero deck. Lastly, Masked Heroes, based on Jaden's deck in the manga, were hero monsters that could be summoned with Mask changed, which sent a hero from field to grave to summon a masked hero of the same attribute from the extra deck, serving as a pseudo one-material fusion summon. At first, this mechanic was not worth it at all with monsters like Goka and Vapor, but it would eventually receive the much more desirable targets like Acid and Diane, giving more desirability to the archetype, namely in its ability to send Absolute Zero to summon Acid, which would result in a full board wipe. The last notable innovation of fusions would be in the tail end of the Zexal era with the side set Dragons of Legend in April of 2014, being Eye of Timaeus, a spell that let you fusion summon a monster that takes a Dark Magician monster as material using only that monster on the field. This could be seen as the next step of single monster fusion summons after Mask Change, which at the time could only summon Dark Magician Girl the Dragon Knight and Amulet Dragon. At the time, Dark Magician was still a decently hard card to get on the field reliably, so it saw almost no play on release, though would be considered as a splash option in later Dark Magician decks, though could not be searched by their effects as it does not specifically mention Dark Magician on the card, rather it mentions Dark Magician monsters. With that, fusion summoning in the Zexal era came to an end with practically no real innovations, though the groundwork had been laid for the next era to bring sweeping changes to the mechanic as a whole. Thank you all for watching this deep dive analysis. I do greatly appreciate you guys watching to the very end of this video. If you enjoy content like this, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more like it. If you want more details on the behind the scenes for these, please follow me on Twitter or check out my Twitch streams whenever they happen. Both links are in the description below. Thank you all again, and I'll see you next time.